Hey everyone, tonight we're setting sail into the surprisingly intricate world of medieval navigation, where survival wasn't just about courage or luck, but about understanding the sea's moods better than your own. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. It's the year 1347, and you're standing on the deck of a merchant vessel somewhere in the North Sea. The horizon is a wall of black clouds, and the wind is starting to howl like something out of a nightmare. Your captain, a weathered man with salt-stained clothes and hands like leather, is shouting orders that barely cut through the growing storm. This isn't a movie. This isn't a romantic adventure tale. This is Tuesday afternoon for a medieval sailor, and your life depends entirely on knowledge passed down through generations of men who learned to read the sea like scripture. Most people think medieval sailors were just brave idiots who pointed their boats toward the horizon and hoped for the best. That's not history, that's Hollywood. The reality is far more fascinating. These men developed an entire science of survival that would make modern meteorologists pause in respect. They didn't have weather satellites or radar or even accurate maps. What they had was something far more valuable. They had wisdom earned through centuries of watching their friends die when they got it wrong. Let's start with something most landlubbers never consider. Medieval sailors could smell a storm coming from miles away. Literally smell it. The air changes before a tempest hits. It becomes heavier, carries different scents from the deep ocean, and experienced mariners trained their noses like wine tasters. They could distinguish between the metallic tang that meant lightning, the earthy smell that indicated heavy rain, and the strange emptiness that warned of the kind of wind that could snap a mast in half. But smell was just the beginning. These sailors watched the water itself like it was speaking to them. And in many ways, it was. The colour of the sea told stories. Deep blue meant deep water and relative safety. Green suggested shallows or unusual currents. Grey indicated churning sediment, which could mean dangerous weather ahead. But the most important colour was black. When patches of water turned black while everything else remained normal, smart captains changed course immediately. That darkness meant wind, serious wind, the kind that could drive waves tall enough to swallow entire vessels. The waves themselves were a language these men learned to read fluently. Not just their size, which any fool could see, but their rhythm. Waves created by local wind moved differently than swells generated by distant storms. A captain could look at the pattern of water around his ship and know whether the weather threatening him was still a day away or bearing down in the next hour. They learned to distinguish between the short, choppy waves that meant shifting local winds and the long, rolling swells that indicated a massive storm system somewhere beyond the horizon. Medieval sailors also developed an almost supernatural ability to read clouds. Not just whether they looked threatening, but their specific shapes, their movement patterns, their colours at different times of day. Certain cloud formations meant wind, but no rain. Others promised torrential downpours with relatively calm seas. Some indicated the kind of sudden, violent squalls that could appear out of nowhere and disappear just as quickly. The most dangerous clouds were the ones that seemed to move against the prevailing wind. That meant conflicting air masses, which often produced the kind of chaotic weather that could tear a ship apart. But perhaps the most remarkable skill these sailors possessed was their ability to navigate by feel. They could sense changes in the ship's movement that indicated shifting winds or dangerous currents long before these changes became visible. A subtle change in how the vessel rolled, a different vibration in the deck planking, a new sound from the rigging. These men lived on their ships for months at a time, and they knew every creak, every movement, every normal sound their vessels made. When something felt wrong, they investigated immediately. The tools they used were deceptively simple, but devastatingly effective. Every ship carried what they called a weather glass, essentially a primitive barometer made from a sealed glass tube partially filled with water. When air pressure dropped, indicating approaching storms, the water level would rise. When pressure increased, suggesting clearing weather, the level would fall. These devices weren't particularly accurate by modern standards, but they didn't need to be. Medieval sailors weren't trying to predict the weather 3 days in advance. They just needed to know whether the next few hours were going to kill them. They also used lead lines, weighted ropes that they dropped overboard to measure water depth. But these served a dual purpose. The bottom of the lead weight was hollowed out and filled with tallow, a type of animal fat. When the weight hit the sea floor, it would pick up samples of sand, mud, or rock. Experienced navigators could identify their location by the type of material that stuck to the importantly for storm survival tallow. More, they could detect sudden changes in depth that might indicate dangerous currents or underwater obstacles that could destroy their ship in rough weather. Perhaps most ingeniously, medieval sailors learned to use seabirds as their own personal weather service. Different species of birds behave predictably before storms. Gulls would fly inland and seek shelter. Petrels would disappear entirely from the surface of the water. Cormorants would gather in large groups and fly in specific patterns that indicated wind direction. Some birds would actually follow storms, riding the air currents, and smart sailors learned to distinguish between birds fleeing weather and birds chasing it, but knowledge meant nothing without the skill to act on it. When medieval sailors detected an approaching storm, they had to make a series of rapid decisions that could mean the difference between reaching port safely and becoming another cautionary tale. The first decision was whether to run for shelter or ride out the storm at sea. This wasn't always obvious. Sometimes the nearest harbour was more dangerous than the open ocean, especially if the storm was approaching from a direction that would drive ships onto rocks or into shallow water. If they chose to seek shelter, they had to identify safe harbours quickly. Medieval ports weren't equipped with lighthouses or detailed charts. Sailors had to recognise safe anchorages by the shape of the coastline, the colour of the water, and the behaviour of local wildlife. They memorised the locations of hidden rocks, dangerous currents, and seasonal changes that could turn a safe harbour into a death trap. When shelter wasn't an option, they had to prepare their ships for battle against the elements. This involved far more than just securing loose cargo and checking the rigging. Medieval ships were designed to flex with the waves rather than fight them, but this required careful adjustment of the sails and rigging to work with the storm rather than against it. Too much sail and the wind would tear the masts apart. Too little, and the ship would lose steerage and become helpless against the waves. The art of storm sailing was passed down through generations of master mariners who understood that the sea demanded respect, not conquest. They learned to read the subtle signs that meant survival, and they taught their crews that arrogance in the face of nature was the fastest way to an early grave. The most experienced captains developed what they called sea sense, an almost mystical ability to feel trouble brewing in their bones. They claimed they could predict storms hours before any visible signs appeared, and modern science suggests they weren't entirely wrong. Changes in atmospheric pressure affect the human body in subtle ways. Joint pain increases, headaches develop, and some people report a general feeling of unease. Medieval sailors, who spent their entire lives at sea, became exquisitely sensitive to these physical warnings. But surviving a storm required more than just predicting it. Once the wind began to howl and the waves started building, medieval sailors had to transform their vessels into floating fortresses capable of withstanding nature's assault. The first priority was always the cargo. Loose items became deadly projectiles in rough seas, capable of smashing through hull planking or crushing crew members. Everything had to be secured, not just tied down, but wedged, lock-braced, and into place with an almost obsessive attention to detail. The ship's ballast, usually stones or sand carried in the lowest part of the hull, became critically important during storms. Too little ballast and the vessel would ride too high in the water, making it unstable and prone to capsizing. Too much and it would sit too low, allowing waves to break over the deck and potentially swamp the ship. Experienced sailors could adjust their ballast by shifting cargo or even throwing items overboard if necessary, constantly balancing their vessel's stability against the changing conditions. Medieval sails were far more sophisticated than most people realize. They weren't just large pieces of cloth hung from poles. Different types of storms required different sail configurations, and master mariners carried an arsenal of specialized canvas for various weather conditions. Storm sails were smaller, heavier, and made from tightly woven fabric that could withstand tremendous wind pressure without tearing. They were positioned differently on the masts to give the captain maximum control over the ship's direction and speed. The technique of heaving to was perhaps the most important storm survival skill these sailors possessed. This involved positioning the sails and rudder in such a way that the ship would essentially park itself in the water, riding the waves at an angle that minimized stress on the hull and rigging. A properly hove-to vessel would drift slowly sideways through the water, presenting its strongest profile to the waves while maintaining enough forward motion to respond to the helm. Masters of this technique could keep their ships stable in conditions that would destroy less experienced crews. Water management became a life or death concern during severe storms. No medieval ship was completely watertight, and rough seas inevitably meant water coming aboard. Ships carried multiple pumps, usually operated by hand, and maintaining these pumps was considered one of the most crucial skills any sailor could possess. But pumping wasn't enough. Medieval sailors also learned to plug leaks temporarily, using everything from wooden plugs to sailcloth stuffed with tar. Some carried specially trained ship's cats, not just for catching rats, but because cats could detect the sound of water entering the hull in places humans might miss. The psychological aspect of storm survival was just as important as the physical preparation. Medieval crews were often made up of men from different regions, speaking different languages, with varying levels of experience. During a storm, clear communication and absolute discipline were essential. Captains developed systems of commands that could be understood even of wind and waves. Han over-the-rod signals, bell codes, and simplified verbal orders ensured that critical instructions reached every crew member when their lives depended on immediate action. Medieval sailors also understood the importance of rest and nutrition during extended storms. They learned to take turns sleeping in short shifts, even during the worst, because exhaust weather eased crews made fatal mistakes. They carried special storm rations, foods that could be eaten without cooking, and provided sustained energy during periods of intense physical labor. Dried meat, hard bread, and fermented beverages that wouldn't spoil in damp conditions formed the backbone of their emergency supplies. Perhaps most remarkably, these sailors developed techniques for repairing their ships while still at sea during storms. They carried spare canvas, rope, and wooden planks, along with the tools needed to make emergency repairs. Some crews became so skilled at shipboard carpentry that they could replace damaged masts or patch hull breaches while waves crashed over their decks. These repairs weren't pretty or permanent, but they kept ships afloat long enough to reach safety. The art of reading currents became especially critical during storms. Ocean currents don't stop during bad weather, and understanding how these underwater rivers behaved could mean the difference between being pushed towards safety or driven onto rocks. Medieval navigators learned to detect currents by watching floating debris, feeling changes in water temperature, and observing how their ships drifted when the sails were furled. They memorized current patterns around familiar coastlines and could use this knowledge to their advantage, even in the worst conditions. Medieval sailors also developed an intricate understanding of how different types of storms behaved. Summer squalls were violent but brief, requiring different tactics than the slow-building winter gales that could last for days. Coastal storms had different characteristics than open ocean tempests. Each type of weather system demanded its own approach. its own preparations, and its own survival strategies. The concept of storm seasons was deeply embedded in medieval maritime culture. Experienced sailors knew that certain times of year were more dangerous than others, and they planned their voyages accordingly. The period from late autumn through early spring was considered especially treacherous in northern waters, while summer brought different challenges, including sudden thunderstorms and unpredictable wind shifts. This seasonal awareness influenced everything from cargo scheduling to crew recruitment. Communication between ships during storms was another crucial survival skill. Medieval fleets developed systems of signals using flags, lanterns, and even smoke that could be seen and understood even in poor weather conditions. Ships would stay within visual contact when possible, sharing information about safe passages, dangerous areas, and changing weather conditions. A fleet that worked together had a much better chance of survival than individual vessels trying to weather storms alone. The aftermath of storms presented its own challenges and opportunities. Experienced captains knew how to assess damage quickly and prioritize repairs. They understood which problems needed immediate attention and which could wait until they reached port. Storm-damaged ships were vulnerable to additional weather, so getting the vessel back to seaworthy condition as quickly as possible was always the top priority. These medieval mariners also learned to read the signs that indicated when storms were finally passing. Changes in wind direction, shifts in wave patterns, and the appearance of certain types of clouds all signaled that conditions were improving. But they never assumed a storm was over until they had clear evidence. Many ships were lost when crews relaxed their vigilance too early, only to be caught off guard by a storm's final violent surge. The relationship between medieval sailors and their ships was far more intimate than most people realize. These men didn't just work on their vessels, they lived with them, slept with them, and developed an almost supernatural connection to every timber, rope, and piece of canvas. During storms, this bond became their lifeline. A sailor who truly knew his ship could feel trouble in the hull before it became visible, sense when the rigging was under too much stress, and detect the subtle changes in movement that warned of impending disaster. Medieval shipbuilders understood something that modern naval architects are only beginning to appreciate. Ships needed to be flexible, not rigid. The vessels of this era were constructed with joints that could move, timbers that could bend, and hulls that could twist with the waves rather than fight them. This flexibility was achieved through careful selection of woods, strategic placement of iron fittings, and construction techniques that allowed the entire structure to work as a living system. During severe storms, crews could actually hear their ships groaning and creaking as the hull flexed with each wave, sounds that would terrify landlubbers, but reassured experienced sailors that their vessel was doing exactly what it was designed to do. The hierarchy aboard medieval ships during storms was absolute and unforgiving. The captain's word was law, not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. In conditions where a single wrong decision could kill everyone aboard, there was no time for debate or discussion. Below the captain, each crew member had specific responsibilities that had been drilled into them through countless hours of practice. The helmsman controlled the ship's direction, the sailmaster managed the canvas, and ordinary sailors handled the rigging and pumps. This system worked because everyone understood that their individual survival depended entirely on the group's coordinated response to danger. Medieval sailors developed an almost religious reverence for the tools of their trade. Their knives were kept razor sharp, not just for practical reasons, but because a dull blade could mean the difference between cutting free a fouled line in time to save the ship, or watching helplessly as the rigging tore itself apart. Rope was treated like precious metal, carefully maintained, regularly inspected, and replaced at the first sign of wear. These men understood that in a storm, their lives literally hung by threads, and they treated those threads with appropriate respect. The concept of teamwork during medieval storms went far beyond simple cooperation. Crews developed an almost telepathic ability to work together in conditions where normal communication was impossible. Hand signals, body language, and shared understanding allowed them to coordinate complex maneuvers while hurricane-force winds made shouting useless. New sailors were integrated into these teams through months of training in calm weather, learning not just their individual tasks, but how their actions affected everyone else aboard. Food and water management during extended planning and strict storms required careful normal circumstances, but during storms, it disciplined. Fresh water was precious and became even more critical. Crews had to balance the need to stay hydrated with the reality that they might be at sea far longer than originally planned. They learned to catch rainwater using specially designed canvas collectors, but this required careful timing and positioning to avoid contaminating their drinking supply with salt spray. Emergency food supplies were rationed not by quantity, but by energy content, ensuring that the most physically demanding jobs went to sailors who had consumed enough calories to perform them safely. The psychological warfare between sailors and storms was perhaps the most brutal aspect of medieval sea survival. Storms didn't just threaten ships with physical destruction, they attacked the minds of the men who sailed them. The constant noise, the violent motion, the spray of freezing salt water, and the ever-present threat of death created a form of mental stress that could break even experienced sailors. Captains learned to recognize the signs of crew members reaching their psychological breaking points and developed techniques for maintaining morale during the darkest hours of a storm. Sleep deprivation was an inevitable part of storm survival, but medieval sailors learned to manage it strategically. They discovered that short periods of rest were more effective than trying to sleep for extended periods in impossible conditions. Experienced crews developed rotating watch systems that ensured some men were always alert while others recovered their strength. The art of sleeping while standing, wedged into secure positions that prevented them from being thrown around the ship, became a survival skill that could mean the difference between being ready for the next crisis or being too exhausted to respond effectively. Medieval ships carried an arsenal of emergency equipment that most people never hear about in romantic tales of the sea. Spare anchors, emergency tillers, backup pumps, and even prefabricated patches for hull damage were standard equipment on well-prepared vessels. But perhaps more important than the equipment itself was the crew's knowledge of how to use it under extreme conditions. Replacing a broken tiller in calm weather was routine maintenance, but doing the same job while waves crashed over the deck and the ship pitched violently required skills that took years to develop. The art of emergency navigation during storms was a closely guarded secret among master mariners. When compasses failed, when the sun and stars were invisible, and when familiar landmarks were obscured by rain and spray, these men had to find their way using techniques that bordered on magic. They learned to navigate by the sound of waves breaking on distant shores, by the smell of different types of vegetation carried on the wind, and by subtle changes in watercolor that indicated proximity to land. Some claimed they could determine their location by tasting the seawater, detecting minute differences in salinity that revealed their position relative to major river mouths. The maintenance of mental maps was crucial for survival during storms. Medieval sailors couldn't rely on written charts that might be destroyed by water damage or blown away by wind. Instead, they memorized incredibly detailed mental pictures of coastlines, harbor entrances, and underwater hazards. These mental maps included not just physical features, but also seasonal changes, tidal patterns, and local weather phenomena. A master navigator could reconstruct an accurate picture of hundreds of miles of coastline entirely from memory, complete with information about safe anchorages, dangerous currents, and reliable sources of fresh water. The relationship between medieval sailors and the sea creatures they encountered during storms reveals another fascinating aspect of their survival strategies. Dolphins were considered good omens, not out of superstition, but because their presence indicated certain types of currents and weather patterns. Whales were watched carefully because their behavior often predicted changes in sea conditions hours before human senses could detect them. Even seaweed and floating debris provided valuable information about currents, recent weather in other areas, and the proximity of land. Medieval storm survival also required an understanding of human endurance that went far beyond physical strength. These sailors learned to pace themselves during extended periods of crisis, conserving energy for the moments when maximum effort was required, while maintaining alertness during the long hours of waiting and watching. They discovered that panic was contagious, but so was calm confidence, and experienced crew members became masters at projecting reassurance, even when they themselves were terrified. The concept of acceptable loss was hardwired into medieval maritime culture. Sailors understood that sometimes saving the ship required sacrificing cargo, that preserving human life might mean abandoning valuable equipment, and that survival often demanded choices that landlubbers would consider unthinkable. This wasn't callousness, but practical wisdom earned through generations of men who learned that the sea demanded payment, and smart sailors chose what they were willing to give up rather than letting the ocean choose for them. The aftermath of surviving a major storm created bonds between crew members that lasted for life. Men who had faced death together at sea developed a trust and understanding that went far beyond ordinary friendship. These relationships form the backbone of medieval maritime communities, creating networks of experienced sailors who could be called upon when assembling crews for dangerous voyages. A sailor's reputation for storm survival was his most valuable possession, more important than money or social status. Medieval sailors also understood that storm survival wasn't just about individual voyages, but about building knowledge that would benefit future generations. They developed informal but effective systems for sharing information about new hazards, successful survival techniques, and changes in familiar sea routes. This collective wisdom was passed down through stories, songs, and practical demonstrations, creating a body of knowledge that grew more sophisticated with each generation of mariners. The physical conditioning required for medieval storm survival was unlike anything most people can imagine. These men developed the strength to work for hours in conditions that would exhaust modern athletes in minutes. Their hands became so calloused they could handle rope that would slice through normal skin, and their sense of balance became so refined they could work effectively on pitching decks that would leave landlubbers helplessly seasick. This conditioning wasn't achieved through formal training, but through years of gradually increasing exposure to harsh conditions. Perhaps most remarkably, medieval sailors learned to find moments of beauty and wonder, even in the midst of life-threatening storms. They spoke of the terrible majesty of mountainous waves, the awesome power of lightning reflected in churning water, and the profound silence that sometimes fell in the eye of a hurricane. These weren't romantic fantasies, but practical observations that helped them maintain their humanity during experiences that could easily have driven them mad. The legacy of medieval storm survival techniques influenced maritime culture for centuries afterward. Many of the methods these sailors developed remained in use well into the age of steam power, and some principles continue to influence modern seamanship. Their understanding of weather patterns, their techniques for ship handling in extreme conditions, and their approaches to crew management during crisis situations laid the foundation for everything that followed in naval history. And so these medieval mariners, with nothing but experience and instinct, mastered what modern technology still struggles to predict. They turned survival into an art form, reading the sea's secrets in ways we've largely forgotten. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember that somewhere in the darkness, the ocean still whispers the same ancient warnings to those who know how to listen.